All right. Good morning. How is everybody? Let's see if this is working. Here it's working. Yes. That's great. So we were talking last time, and I forgot I didn't get here early enough to put the ducks out on the table, so I guess I'll have to walk around when I ask questions today. So my truck is in the shop, and I had to borrow my mother's car to get down here, which meant that I was running late. So I apologize for not getting those out so that you can just grab them. But I'll just walk around today. If you guys answer any questions, and today's really, it's going to get very, very deep and very, very heavy. So I don't know how many questions there will be or how many answers there will be, but we'll try. So we were talking last time about the idea of modern ethical theory and the idea of utilitarianism. And I say that modern theory begins in the Quattrocento and in Italy with the thinking of Niccolo Bernardo de Machiavelli, who writes The Prince, and this is the first modern work of philosophy that begins to separate the divine from the sort of everyday facts of life. You see in Machiavelli a very modern man. We get this impression from Machiavelli's writings, particularly in The Prince, that if you talk to him, he would understand the world as we know it today. It's a very straightforward philosophy of the way the world actually works. Right now, if we go back to Plato again, he would say the way the world actually works is not really the business of the philosopher, but we could philosophize on that. So we talked about Machiavelli never comes up with the formula, the ends justify the means, but you can tease it out of The Prince. Who does come up with that? Well, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. In Utility, they come up with this idea. Now, the purest form of utilitarianism, as you'll recall from last time, is act utilitarianism, where I have to do this calculus every single time I interact with somebody else. I have to think about what the greatest good is. And I suggested to you that the problems with this are that, first of all, how do we know when we get into a highly complex world what's going to happen 50 years from now? The automobile, would we hold Henry Ford responsible for all of the death and destruction that has occurred as a result of the automobile? I mean, how many of you have known somebody who's died in an automobile wreck? Almost all of us have. That's horrible, right? I mean, it happens all the time. Our environment is being degraded constantly as a result of this. Now, as a result of electric cars, and probably in the next 10 to 15 years, I would imagine that the vast majority of cars on the road will be electric. I went to the auto show at the fair. The fair has started. This is my favorite fall activity, is the Oklahoma State Fair. And I always tell students you should go to the fair. This is a completely Western, sort of hearkening back to our agricultural roots phenomenon. You don't have these. They do have fairs and stuff like that in New York, but they're not big the way they are in Oklahoma. I think at one time we had the largest fair in the nation. People go to the Iowa Fair to campaign in election years. It's a huge thing. All of the candidates in presidential election years will go to Iowa because Iowa holds the first selection process for the way we choose candidates for the presidential election. And so people go to the fair, and you should go to the fair. I have a season pass. I posted my season pass, and I go every day to the fair on Facebook, and I already started with comments and people like, how is it that you can possibly go to the fair this many days and enjoy it? Well, it's fascinating to me. First of all, I grew up on a cattle ranch in northern New Mexico, and so I have that sort of history. But as a marketer, I really find the fair, the cattle and all of that, I go to all of those shows because I like to see them. And that's become a very small part of the fair. The biggest part of the fair is things like the auto show. And the reason I bring this up is because I went to the auto show, and Ford is selling now a all electric truck. I never thought we would see that day, but here it is. It's $100 and something odd thousand, according to the sticker price at the Oklahoma State Fair. So it's fascinating to me what people would rather have than their own money. You walk through the buildings, and I understand people want cars. That's sort of a natural thing that they would want to have. But there's all this other stuff that they sell. The Ginsu knives, the stainless steel pots that are not supposed to stick, and all stainless steel is non-stick to begin with. right? It's when you start cooking on it, you scratch it, and that's what makes it start to stick. It gets little micro scratches in it, and that's why it starts to stick. But initially they're sitting there and they're frying up an egg in the stainless steel pan, and you buy it. 6 months later, it's starting to stick, or faster than that when you put it in the dishwasher and you put it with other pots and pans, and it starts to get degraded. So it's fascinating to me what people would rather have than their own money to just walk around. And there are things that are sold at the fair that I don't understand how they are being sold at the fair, because I understand a collection of pots and pans. What is that? Probably $500 or less or something like that to buy. And I can understand buying the pots and pans and trying it, but they actually sell every year there. They have these massage chairs. How many of you have tried these out? I just can't stand the thought of getting into a device that everybody else who look at the people that go to the fair, and you start to wonder how they got the money to get into the fair. That's another thing that's just fascinating to me. And they're, taking their shoes off and climbing in the massage chair. And I'm like, not so much. Don't think I'm going to do that. But I don't understand why those are like $5,000. I'm thinking that I want somebody who has a shop where when it breaks down, I can get, satisfaction and that it's going to be repaired for this amount of money. That's a substantial investment. So there's all of these things at the fair that you would rather have than your own money. And I just find that absolutely fascinating. So we've the car has been invented, and Henry Ford, would we hold him responsible for all of this stuff? I mean, the reason that we can go to the fair and we can degrade the environment getting there and I'm guilty of this. I drive a Dodge Dually 3500, which gets, a wonderful, actually 18 miles to the gallon, which I think is fantastic, considering my brother just bought a brand new Jeep Grand Cherokee. It's got the massaging chair seats in the front seats of his car, and the back seats even are heated and cooled. The front seats are heated and cooled. It's got an entertainment system for all of the passengers. It's got all of this stuff. And that car gets a wonderful 12 miles to the gallon, whether you want it or not. I mean, it's just incredible. So we're pumping all of this stuff out into the atmosphere. Would we hold Henry Ford liable for all of this? Well, a lot of us would say that's just not really fair. We talked about this idea of, when you were a kid, did you make breakfast for your parents and it turned out poorly and the fire alarm was going off? You had good intentions, right? But it turns out bad. And so is that fair to hold people accountable? Now, when I give you the criticisms of all of these ideas of what we call the valid theories, what I want you to keep in mind is that there is no one perfect theory. But we're going to talk about today the invalid theories when we get to postmodernity. And what you have to remember is what makes the theory valid. And as I talk about this and I give you the criticisms, and I told you what the criticisms were, for example, of Aristotle's ethics in his idea of virtue. That is, what is the purpose of a human being? Can we know that? Even if we can decide on that, can we teach these virtues? And I think those are all really unfair. I think we really ought to consider virtue ethics because it is a holistic approach. But when we talk about utilitarianism, there's a lot to dislike there, right? But what does make it valid? What makes the theory valid as opposed to not valid? And one of the things that you should know for an exam which is coming up is these are the things that make it valid, and these are the theories that you're going to want to use on your paper. And every single semester I have students that use non-valid theories. Now, let me tell you how I grade, because I always get a lot of pushback the first exam that you take because people don't listen to me. You stop. I say this, it's on the video. When I teach this class online, you have access to the video. I put out examples. There are examples in D2L of what is a C-level grade on the essays, and nobody ever listens to me. And then they always want to argue with me about they did the assignment, and the first thing that they do is they use some invalid theory. They'll use psychological egoism, which we'll probably get to today. And I'm like, that's an automatic failure. If you can't even get the theory right, it's an automatic fail. Now you can get close, right? The way I grade and the way the rubric works is you can get close if you have the wrong. And my first initial doctorate was in law, and that's the way law school works, right? Actually, it's the way the bar exam works, not so much law school. But there are right and wrong answers on the bar exam, on the essay portion of the bar. If you get the wrong answer, you can get close. You can get points because it's an average. You can get enough points to still pass the bar if you totally flub one essay, if you make a good enough argument. But if you get the answer right, you can't get a passing grade on that essay. So you have to get the answer right. And the first thing that the essay questions tell you is you must use a valid ethical theory in your argument, right? So what makes the theory valid and why should you know this? One, it is reliant on reason. It doesn't rely on emotion. It is non-emotive. The invalid theories that we'll talk about are emotive. Two, it can be universally applicable. And three, it allows for no exceptions. It doesn't allow for exceptionalism. It doesn't allow me to say, I'm special. I'm exempt from the rules. And this is one of the problems with utilitarianism, is that it doesn't allow you to say, you know, we would have to apply the calculus to Henry Ford and say, he got it wrong. And a lot of us say, he couldn't know. We can't hold people morally culpable for that. So it's a problem, but this is what makes theories, the non-valid theories use emotion. They may not be universally applicable and they allow for exceptions. They allow for me to say, I'm special. My group is special. Right? That's what makes them not valid. So you need to stick to the valid theories when you're using and when you're arguing in the essay. And utilitarianism does this. You could apply utilitarian principles in sub-Saharan Africa. You could apply utilitarian principles in Asia. You can apply it all over the place. It's universally applicable. It's not limited to my group. Now, there are problems, again, saying Henry Ford was a bad man, and he may have been. He was a racist, right? He was an anti-Semite, not a great guy. But, you know, I don't think we can hold the car thing against him necessarily. So then we come up with this idea, well, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with rules. So one of the rules that we come up with is the emission standards, for example, with regard to automobiles. One of the reasons that we have this electric truck down at the Oklahoma State Fair is because we've now started to say, we live on this planet and boy, we're doing a lot of damage to it. And maybe we need to reduce that. And one of the ways that we can reduce that is by controlling emissions. So we're going to come up with a rule. Like the average of your fleet has to have something like 25 miles per gallon or better. I don't know what the actual rule is anymore, but that's close. The problem with rule utilitarianism is still, it attempts to fix this picture, this problem that we have with act utilitarianism. One of the things that I told you that we could justify using act utilitarianism is slavery of very small numbers of people in order to create more happiness. Well, rule utilitarianism attempts to deal with this. It doesn't really do it because you could still come up with a rule that says, we're going to enslave these people for the greater good. And a lot of us just say, that's creepy. Don't do that, right? So what's a theory that we get in response to this? If we think of it in terms of Hegelian dialectic, utilitarianism is the rule, or it's the thesis. We can get an antithesis to utilitarianism, and sort of the antithesis, if we think of it in Hegelian dialectic terms, is something called duty ethics. This is also called rational absolutism. The categorical imperative. Utilitarianism is called teleological from a If you want to name things and you want to know the name of it from a philosophical standpoint, utilitarianism is called teleological ethics because it relies on the telos, the Greek word for the end. So it's teleological. Duty ethics, on the other hand, don't rely on the end. And these are called deontological. If you want to know the philosophical term for what duty ethics is, it's deontological ethics because it deals with duty. So deontological ethics. This again takes two forms. The oldest form is religious absolutism. Now again, what you see, if you go back, so for example, to the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire at one point becomes split between two emperors, the emperor of the West and the emperor in the East, and Constantine gets a sign. I'm reducing history down to a lot here, and historians would be really upset with me, I'm sure, that you will rule in this sign, and he converts to Christianity. So Christianity becomes the official religion, and he does. He conquers the Roman Empire, and he converts to Christianity. Christianity in its early forms is a pacifistic religion, because the one thing that Christ adds, and this is very interesting to me as somebody who studies this stuff, you see these people with their AK-47s or whatever it is, it's not an AK-47, that's a Russian gun, but their weapons standing in front of crosses and proclaiming that they are, defenders of Jesus and the American way and apple pie. And it strikes me as odd that they would use this, because the one thing that Christ adds to the body of theology is this idea of turn the other cheek. They're pacifists. And so this becomes a problem in the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire is sacked, again, I'm reducing history down a lot here, people start to say, look, when we weren't Christian, we didn't have these problems. And so a remarkable person rises to the challenge, and in the City of God, St. Augustine uses Platonic thought and weds it to Christian theology and comes up with this concept of the just war. So you use philosophy and combine it with theology, and you come up with an absolutist doctrine. Thomas Aquinas uses, at a later date, there's this problem in Christendom, this falling apart, and Aquinas marries Aristotelian ethics with Christian doctrine, and is still, as I suggested to you before, the official philosopher of the Holy See. So you can have religious absolutism. Well, what's the problem with religious absolutism? Well, religious absolutism, we're not all going to rely on the religions, right? In fact, Christianity is a minority religion in the world. The vast majority of the rest of the world is something else. If you combine Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, it's a far greater number than are Christians. So Kant comes up with, again, I'm reducing this down, rational absolutism. Rational absolutism. You're no longer going to rely on religion. You're not going to go to the book. What's wrong with going to the book? Again, as I suggest to you, going to the book is going to be problematic, because whose book are we going to use? In the United States, you have all of these people who want to say things like, let's use the Christian Bible because we're a Christian nation. And the founding fathers really weren't against the mixing of church and state. They absolutely were. I just love these people who try and rewrite history and say things like, the founding fathers were all Christians. Well, yeah, okay, sort of. You know, they were pretty deistic in that belief. Thomas Jefferson was certainly deistic in that. And they clearly didn't want religion and the state mixing. Mostly because they were afraid of the impact that the state might have on religion. So I'm always fascinated. Well, what book are we going to use? Well, in the United States, I guess since the vast majority of people identify as Christian, we're going to use the Bible. Which version of the Bible are we going to use? Okay, well, you know, the vast majority of the people in this country are not Catholic, so we'll get rid of the Catholic Bible. There's a plurality that follow the Protestant Bible, but there are various versions of that. Are we going to use the New International Version? Are we going to use the King James Version? You know, I mean, and how are we going to interpret this book? This becomes problematic. Lots of people, you know, you watch these shows. God wrote it so a simple man like me can understand it. No, he actually didn't. First of all, let's get this straight. God didn't sit down at the cosmic computer and whip this out. In the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Bible is the word of God through the words of man, speaking in the idiom of his time. And the richness of the Bible, according to the Archbishop, is that we don't take it as literally so, that it was dictated by God. Prior to the Reformation, the faith of the Holy See said ordinary people shouldn't be reading the Bible because they'll get it wrong. And I think we do. I think we do get it wrong. Let's just take an example of how we get it wrong. These people that want to use religious absolutism and they want to impose absolute rules in the Bible. Well, what is one of the ones that they always, and this is a big debate right now in American society from a political marketing standpoint, and they've lost. And I'm going to tell you why I think they've lost. Largely because non-political marketers have realized that the rewards of that side losing are much greater than the downsides. So what is one of the things that the religious absolutists always want to point to as problematic? In the Bible, in Leviticus 18:20, it says, if a man lies with a man as he lies with a woman, he has committed an abomination. Their blood shall surely be upon them. And they rely on this word, the abomination, right? When the word abomination, the rabbis tell us, this is in the Old Testament, and the rabbis tell us when the word abomination is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is never meant to indicate something that is innately immoral. That is a priori, as Kant would say. That is a priori immoral. It's always used to indicate a customary wrong. So it's the interpretation of this word that matters. Well, you can see why this is problematic, I think, from a marketing standpoint, to use this view, because marketers now say things like, well, you know, I mean, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's so. I mean, this goes back to this Leviticus 18:20 goes back to the sin of Onan. Ancient Hebrews believed, as most people did, that it was the male who contained all of nascent life. Females had nothing to do with it except for the incubation. They didn't understand modern biology. And so in the Bible, we're told that Onan spills his seed upon the earth and God strikes him dead. If we go back in time, the ancient Israelites were living in a hostile area, and this prohibition is about growing a nation. That's what it's about. It's about letting a nation grow. We don't need to do that anymore, do we? We live on a planet that can comfortably support maybe 3 billion people. We now have 7. So you have to think. Again, other places in the world are not going to use the same thing that we use. So this is going to be problematic. So what do we have in terms of rational absolutism? Well, we're going to have something that becomes then universally applicable. Although what religious absolutists would say is it's universally applicable. What we need to do is we just need to impose Christianity on the rest of the world. And they tried this. They've tried this for centuries, right? The Holy See has tried this. It was called the Crusades. They tried to export it. It hasn't always been very successful. So what is it that we can do? Well, Kant comes up with something different. Rather than basing this on the book and somebody's interpretation of the book, which becomes problematic, we can use the mind. We can use a priori knowledge, which is, again, the knowledge that you get from the rectilinear triangle, the 3, 4, 5. How did Pythagoras know this? Well, he knew it from the rational mind. And Kant thinks that we can come up with similar things, like proofs in geometry, and apply it to ethics and come up with the same idea. So, well, what do we get in Kant? I've often thought, by the way, having had to read Kant, that the perfect punishment for students who go to sleep in my class and don't think that this stuff is just absolutely fascinating the way that I think it's absolutely fascinating would be for me to force them to sit there and I will read Kant very slowly to you. There's probably nothing worse than having somebody read something to you. It's just awful. I'll just read it very, very slowly. If you want to read works of philosophy and attempt to sound, and I have a list, by the way, if you're interested in what you should read, if you want to be truly educated. Everybody would debate the list. That's why, everybody can come up with their own list on what you need to read. But I have a good start, I think, of what it takes to be truly educated. And Kant is on the list. But he's really boring. Like, if you want to read a great work of philosophy, read the Socratic dialogues. Those are entertaining. Read the Prince. It's entertaining. Most leaders have read the Prince. Kant is not. Pretty boring. Aristotle, pretty boring. So what does Kant say? Well, Kant says there are 2 types of imperatives. So his 3 great works are a critique of practical reason, a critique of pure reason, and the metaphysics of morals. Kant says there are 2 types of imperatives. What are those 2 types of imperatives? Well, there are hypothetical imperatives, and hypothetical imperatives exist because we want something. What is a hypothetical imperative? Why are you sitting here today letting me talk about Immanuel Kant and not getting up and running from the room? Because, what could this possibly have to do with the modern world and computers and airplanes and cell phones for all? Why is it that you're doing that? Why, I think this is really entertaining. Most students don't. I just got to get through this so I can get a grade, right? Well, why do you want the grade? Because we know that if you go to college, you have a better chance of success. If you become a salesperson, if you get a degree in professional selling, I can almost guarantee you're going to be successful. We have the only program on campus that can say we have 100% placement of our majors and minors. Nursing can say they have 100% placement of their majors, there's no minor. And 80% of my students make $100,000 in their first year. Or close to it. That's why you're here, right? That's a hypothetical imperative. You're here, sitting here listening to me drown on about this stuff because you want those 2 letters or 3 letters after your name. It's 3 letters in the College of Business that says you're educated and you're going to go forth and make a lot of money, the BBA. Right? That's why you're here. Not for the pure joy of this exercise. It's a hypothetical imperative. If you want a chance at a better life, you should go to college. Now I have a lot of students that come to me, in my family, I've got younger people, and they want to know whether or not they should go to college because they just don't think it's worth it. When my mother went to college, well, let's go back to my grandmother. My grandmother went to college years and years and years ago. She would be 100 and something odd years old today if she were still alive. That was very unusual for a woman to go to college. She became the classified records librarian for Sandia National Lab, so she classified nuclear documents for the Department of Energy. Really, really rare. If you had a college degree, when my grandmother, it was just, you were guaranteed you were going to make it to middle class or better. There were so few people that had the college degree. Now, a lot of students ask me, and my younger members of my family say things like, there are lots of people that are making lots of money out there that don't have college degrees. And my response is, that's true. You're going to have to do something. Those people that do that are still doing something. They're going to a trade school or they're learning something that's useful. Like plumber. I have all of these old homes in Guthrie. I've sold one, so I have fewer old homes than I used to in Guthrie. And I spend a lot of time with plumbers because when you have old homes, they have old plumbing, and you spend a lot of time with plumbers and a lot of time with electricians and a lot of time with a lot of other people that you don't necessarily want to spend time with. There's a joke. There's a brain surgeon whose toilet is clogged and he calls a plumber, and the plumber comes in. He goes in and pounds on the toilet for 2 or 3 minutes and comes back out and hands the brain surgeon a bill for $500. And the brain surgeon says, "I'm a brain surgeon. I don't make $500 for 2 minutes worth of work." And the plumber looks at him and said, "Yeah, neither did I when I was a brain surgeon." You're going to have to do something. And I would suggest to you that the reason you're in this room is because it's air conditioned and it's rather pleasant. And although I'm drowning on about Kant, it's more pleasant. Like, yeah, you can make a lot of money in plumbing. It's not really pleasant work. Crawling around under houses is not fun. You can make a lot of money at it, but it's not fun. That's why you're here. That's a hypothetical imperative. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, exist because there is some moral imperative to them. They exist a priori as opposed to a posteriori. What is a posteriori knowledge? Is knowledge that you gain through experience. Why are you here? Because you've seen people that have college degrees that are doing things that you want to do. That's knowledge you gained from experience. You didn't know how to ride a bike until somebody taught you. You had to gain that from experience. A priori knowledge is knowledge that we can gain through minds, through the rational eye. So what is that? Well, Kant says in the categorical imperative, this is the categorical imperative, that you must always treat another rational being as an end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. So you can't do this means-end analysis that we do in utilitarianism, where we're trying to achieve the greatest happiness. That's not going to work for Kant. And it doesn't work for Kant because of these things that we talked about that are problems with utilitarianism. This idea that, like, if you do something and you had good intentions and it turns out badly, well, that just doesn't seem fair. So you always have to treat another rational being as an end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. That's the categorical imperative. Well, what does this mean? Now, this is where I get to the criticism of Kant. And for a long time, as a ethicist, I considered myself a neo-Kantian. What does that mean? Well, you start thinking about the categorical imperative, and after a couple of glasses of wine, you can't help but sort of laugh. What it means, according to Kant, is things like, what do you get out of the categorical imperative? Never lie. Never, ever lie. Why can't you lie? Because when you're lying, you're manipulating somebody. When you're lying, you are using another rational being as a means to an end, rather than as an end in and of themselves. You are using that person. So never lie. Because when you tell the truth, you're letting that rational being make a decision for themselves. You are respecting their autonomy. You're letting them make their own choices. If you're lying, you're not doing that. You're manipulating them. Now, why do I say this? You know, like you can't have a few drinks and begin to recite the categorical imperative and not sort of start to laugh. Never lie. Well, perhaps, and this is one of the things that somebody put in my student evaluations. I just love student evaluations. I tell students about the negative. I never tell them about the good comments that are in my student evaluations. But, you know, I'm going to tell you, so one of my student evaluations said, he's the most arrogant person I've ever met in my entire life. He told his wife that he was divorcing her because she was fat. And I'm just like, I want to scream. I'm like, if you're going to quote me, get the quote right. It's on video, for God's sake. Go back and watch the video. Get the quote right. I never said that I told my wife I was divorcing her because I've never been the one that initiates the breakup. They just happen to me because I say things like, oh, for example, how do I look in this dress? You look like hell in pastels, Robin. This is what I said. You look like death warmed over. You're a winter. Go back upstairs and change. Brutal honesty. Never said she was fat. Said she didn't look good in pastels, which is true. I look good in pastels. Until recently when my hair started to all turn gray. Because I'm half Mexican, so I have black hair and sort of an olive tone. And so I don't look like death. The contrast is remarkable. People with blonde hair and blue eye and fair skin look like death in pastels. Don't wear them. And that's why I'm not married anymore. Because I don't lie. What do most people do? You look fine. You try and take the safe route to these kinds of questions. For those of you who have insignificant others, you look fine. And everyone knows that what you're doing is you're trying to equivocate because fine stands for freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. Fine, you look fine. Comments say don't do that. Now, why is it that we tell these little white lies? You look fine. Well, because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. So maybe we're not manipulating them in a bad way, but you're still manipulating them. No. Now, with regard to my human relations, you know, my brutal honesty, well, that doesn't have a whole lot of negative consequences. Let's take a more serious example. We'll call it the case of the hypothetical of the inquiring murderer. Mr. and Mrs. Jones live next door to you, and Mr. Jones is an alcoholic who often beats Mrs. Jones and has told her, there's a movie about this that Julia Roberts played in called Sleeping with the Enemy. If you've never seen it, it's a frightening tale. He tells her, if you ever leave me, I'll kill you. Mrs. Jones is pulling out of the driveway one day and you say, where are you going? And she says, I'm going to the shelter for battered women. Please don't tell Mr. Jones. 30 minutes later, Mr. Jones comes knocking on the door. Where's my wife? And you know if you don't tell him a lie, she went to Nebraska, she went to see her mother, he's probably gonna guess that she went to the shelter for battered women, and he's gonna go kill her. What do? Kant would say, can't lie. Yep, that's where she went. The shelter for battered women. If bad things happen, but you can't lie. A lot of us would say, oh, when the Nazis are knocking at the door, where are the Jews? Maybe you should lie. Right? How many of you have seen a movie called Pretty Woman? This is unusual. I'm always fascinated by the movies that my students have seen, because that's a really old movie now. It's a rom-com with Julia Roberts again, opposite Richard Gere. She plays a prostitute who gets Richard Gere to see the light. But the reason I tell you about this movie is there's one scene in the movie where Richard Gere what he does is he takes over companies and he breaks them up and he sells the parts, because the parts are worth more than the whole. He engages in arbitrage. There's an old saying, give a man a fish, you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. Teach somebody to arbitrage and you will feed him and his family for generations to come.
Oh, yeah.
So they're at this restaurant and he's negotiating with this guy to take over his company. Of course, the guy he builds ships, doesn't want his company taken over. And he says, look, we'll buy your stock back. All the stock that you've bought, we'll buy it back. And Richard Gere says, no, you won't. You don't have the money. And he says, yeah, we do. We have the money. We've got contracts with the Navy to build ships. And Richard Gere says, no, you don't got the contracts. Senator so-and-so is, on the appropriations committee. Everything goes through appropriations. He's a friend of ours. Like your contracts are dead. Turns out that's a lie. And at the end, Richard Gere, because Julia Roberts' character sort of convinces him that he doesn't make anything. He's just kind of a leech on society, that maybe he should reform his ways, and he does. And at the end, he tells the guy, look, your company's vulnerable. I want to help you. And this is an older man, and Richard Gere is sort of the young hotshot in the movie. And the guy says, well, what about my contracts? He says, oh, they weren't dead. They were just stalled a little bit. And he said, you were lying? And Richard Gere says, yeah, I was bluffing. Is it acceptable to lie in business? Kant would say no. I would say no in that instance too, that's a bad deal, right? Although utilitarians, if you're making everybody money, and I mean, that's one of the things that he says at the beginning in the meeting with this guy, when he says, I'm taking over your company, and the guy says, I don't want to be taken over. It's like, I'm going to make you and your family rich, and I'm going to make a whole lot of people rich, because you don't really know what's best for you, right? Kant would say, don't do that. Don't do that. Well, again, what's wrong with this? Never ever lie. This could lead to some real problems. And I think if you had the opportunity to go back in time and start asking Kant, why is it that you say you can't lie? Why is it that we have to have this rule? Well, ultimately, it's because if we lie, it leads to bad results in the aggregate. There's another movie with Ricky Gervais. This is a more modern movie, but probably some of you have never seen this. Every semester, there's usually one of my students. It's called The Invention of Lying. And it's a funny movie. Ricky Gervais is kind of this dumpy guy who's going on a date. And in the world that he lives in, nobody lies. And he does. He's the first one to lie. So he's kind of this dumpy guy, and he's on this date, and his date's mother calls, or her friend or somebody calls and says, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm on a date. And they're like, well, the question is obviously, are you going to sleep with the guy? She's like, no, I don't think so. He's kind of ugly and dumpy and fat and smells. Brutal honesty. And Ricky Gervais lies. He comes up with the first lie, which is he says something like, if you don't sleep with me, the world is going to end. And once he gets away with it once, he starts realizing he can manipulate people, and he goes to the bank, and they're like, well, you have no money in your account. He's like, that's an error. I have millions of dollars in the account. And like, well, of course, yes, of course, if you say so. And then it's, it spins out of control from there. So it's a movie Kant would like, because ultimately what ends up happening is like it becomes problematic. And so I think that would be the answer that Kant would have to give, is that like ultimately if you lie in the aggregate, if we all did this, it would be problematic. And isn't that really a backdoor way of saying that results really do matter? That results really do, that they really do count. So we've talked about virtue ethics, we've talked about utilitarianism, and now we've talked about deontological ethics or duty ethics. I want to turn to when is postmodernity. So I told you last time that the modern world begins in the Quattrocento with the thinkings of Niccolo Bernardo de Machiavelli, who had an influence on Hobbes. Hobbes takes this, and what you get in Hobbes is you get the Leviathan, and there's, which is, it's a social contract. Government is a social contract. This again is, why is this modern? Because if you go back, and when we talk about these epics, one of the things that I think that we should realize is that there aren't neat breaks in human history. For many people, these old philosophies, and when we talk about marketing philosophies, what we're going to see is that old philosophies continue to play important roles. And we witnessed this with the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The thing that makes Machiavelli modern in The Prince, and that makes Hobbes modern in Leviathan, is there's a strong man, there's a king. The Leviathan is the king in Hobbes's work. But it's a social contract. That's what makes this modern. It's no longer the reliance on a divinity, right? Before this, politics and theology were intimately entwined, and there was this idea of the divine right of kings. And we've seen this, remnants of this, in the funeral. For 10 days, Britain has basically come to a standstill. And everything in Great Britain closed, much to the annoyance of many people, for the death of one woman who was not elected to this position. She got it because her father was king. This goes back to the divine right of kings. So this is, we have remnants of this kind of thinking. Now, I will admit, as a Republican, small r Republican, not big R Republican, small r Republican, I generally think like monarchy is a stupid idea. At least in that sense of the divine right of kings. We watched all of this howling, hysterical sorrow. And believe me, I actually think that woman was worth the howling, hysterical sorrow that we witnessed for 10 days. But not because of what she was born into, but because she did the job that she didn't want and didn't ask for with grace and dignity. But now that she's gone, maybe it's time to think about whether or not we really want to. This, again, this idea of hereditary monarchy harkens back to this idea of divine right of kings. And that just seems to me to be anti-capitalistic. If we want to have a strongman ruler, if we want to have a Leviathan, if we want to have a king, maybe we should turn it over to someone like Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway, the Oracle of Omaha. He is the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. Let's see today. Berkshire stock. Let's get the stock quote for today. One share of Berkshire Hathaway stock today is worth $418,000, $491.63. Maybe that's who we should decide should be king. He took Berkshire from nothing, and its stock is worth almost $500,000 today. That's incredible. He was asked to take over Salomon Brothers. Maybe that's who we should like. Maybe we should have a strong man, but it shouldn't be relying upon this idea of a hereditary ruler, right? If you believe in that. You can have a Republican form of government in which you still have a very strong imperial, for example, presidency. So we have these remnants harkening back. So modernity begins with Machiavelli, and Hobbes takes it further in Leviathan in this idea of the social contract. What marks post-modernity? So I've asked you when the modern era begins. And there is a historian, by the way, a lot of you came up with this idea that modernity begins with the Industrial Revolution. There's a historian who wrote a book called The Birth of the Modern, and he says that really the Industrial Revolution is the beginning of modernity. Although most scholars disagree with that, they think it begins with Machiavelli, because this is where you see a distinct break. Now, his argument is that the Industrial Revolution allowed for the first time masses of people to participate in a way that they never participated before. And that's true. But again, history and these ideas are not neat units that we can say this is for everybody. There were plenty of people. And why is it modernity? Why do we call this the modern era? Because it is a break with what was the Dark Ages. Now, what were the Dark Ages and why were they dark? You know, nobody ran around before Machiavelli saying, oh, it's so dark here, I wish somebody would turn on the lights. That's not what happened. They were the Dark Ages because there was a loss of classicism. There was a loss of knowledge of Aristotle and these ideas of the classics. And with the birth of Machiavelli and the writing of The Prince, we begin a modern era, and that leads to the Enlightenment, where there's a rediscovery of these ideas and this rejection of this lack of reason. Again, historians would be horrified at my oversimplification of these things. So what is the birth of post-modernity then? Why is it postmodern? And for many people, the modern era, or even a pre-modern era, is working really, really well for them. What marks the beginning of the postmodern era? It begins at the beginning. The Industrial Revolution is really the beginning of postmodern thought. And why do I say that? Well, it begins with the writings of one guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. And I can tell you what I think Nietzsche says, and thus spoke Zarathustra. And somebody else will tell you that I'm crazy and I don't know what I'm talking about. And that may be true. But what is it that makes Nietzsche, almost for everybody, I think that this is one thing that they can agree on, even though they might disagree with my interpretation of Nietzsche. What makes Nietzsche completely postmodern? Well, for Machiavelli, it's not that God and religion are unimportant. It's just that I'm going to focus on the way things are actually working. Rather than talking about these ideas, I'm going to tell you how power actually works in The Prince. And I divorce the divine from the profane. What makes Nietzsche postmodern? What is Nietzsche's most famous quote? I'm going to tell you what the most famous quote is. Anybody know? Nobody knows. God is dead. God is dead. Why is this postmodern? And what makes this postmodern? Why is this problematic for business, maybe? Well, what does it mean if I say that God is dead? Now, Nietzsche thought that God was alive at one point in time, and this is where people may disagree with my interpretation. Nietzsche thought that God was alive at one time because we needed him. We needed this mythology. But at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, science becomes, and this is, so there's a point at which philosophy becomes divorced from science. And science goes off And if you go back to that period of time, to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was enormous optimism in the world. There was this optimism that science was going to prove and provide for all of our problems. They were having world expos and they were introducing all of these fantastic things. For those of you who are using these computers that have, static state systems in them, I mean, you're just, and that's just a derivative of really what began in the Industrial Revolution, where really we began to improve the lives of common people. And most people thought that this was going to prove to be the way out, the way forward. This was going to end all of our problems. And Nietzsche looks around at this, I think, and says, you people are crazy. The world is not getting better. The world's getting worse. At one point in time, we needed God. He's now dead. We are relying on science now to solve our problems. We don't give them up to God. Now, why do I say that when we talk about these epics, that people still cling? Why is it that Life Church out here has 1 million members or something? Because there are people who still need this. They still cling to an old philosophy. They still believe that they need, and why do they need God? Well, because Nietzsche would say it's the opiate of the masses. They're just not real bright. But this idea that science is going to cure it, that's frightening. And he's prophetic in that. Because we look at this technology, and yes, this stuff that we market, that we produce, has led to enormous amounts of good for us, but it's also led to an enormous amount of pain and suffering. Nietzsche writes this before 2 world wars. The 2 world wars that we fought were fought, and they used science to kill people on massive levels. We used science in World War II to develop, in my home state, I'm from New Mexico, that's where the first nuclear bomb was built. My grandfather worked for the Manhattan Project. That's how my grandmother became classified records librarian at Sandia. She classified documents that led to the destruction of entire cities in mere seconds. So Nietzsche's pretty prophetic. What does this mean? This postmodern world? Well, if I told you that I could give you a proof that would prove that God doesn't exist, wouldn't that mean the end of objective reality for a lot of people? Why is it that a lot of people continue to be good? Well, I think a lot of us would argue that people continue to be good because they believe in this external reward, the cosmic cookie. That when you die, you're going to go to heaven and you're going to be rewarded. And if I can prove to you that God doesn't exist, maybe you would behave differently tomorrow than you did today. It all goes out the window. So postmodernity teaches us to question everything. Question everything. That's the wheels of doubt get to rolling with Nietzsche and this idea that God is dead. And once those wheels are started, it's very hard to shut off. Now, I'm going to tell you that you all are in the patrimony of Nietzsche, even though you don't think it. So, when I ask my students these questions, if I get them to raise their hands, which I'm not going to ask you to do, how many of you believe in God and Jesus and, the Trinity and all, like there's a lot of hands that go up. That doesn't seem very postmodern, right? But why are you postmodern? When I first started teaching, so I graduated with my undergraduate degree. I started out at OU, and I went to OU, and I will tell you, I absolutely hated it. I walked into my first class. There were 250 people in an auditorium. I hadn't graduated with 250 people. And the professor, I still remember him. He's still there. His name was Alan Hertzke. And he walked to the beginning of the front of the class. He may have retired by now, but he was still there the last time I checked. And he said, I'm going to tell you about the way college really works. I'm an assistant professor here. I have 7 years to publish 3 major works and get a book deal. And if that happens, I'll make associate professor and get tenure. And then I have another 7 years to get to full. So if you think I'm here for you, I'm not. And if you think the graduate assistants that are in this room are here for you, they're all stressed out because they're working on their degrees and they're not here for you either. And that was with that, class ended for the day. So I went there for a year and I decided, God, I just really don't like this. So I came to UCO and I graduated. And when I started teaching here, some of my former professors, like one of them said, no, I'm going to give you some advice, Grant. And I said, what's that, Dr. Jones? And he said, so I was a political scientist at the time. He said, you can always tell a good class from a bad class in less than 30 seconds. And I said, really, Dr. Jones, how's that? And he said, in the morning when you walk in, if you have a bad class, you'll say, good morning, class, and they will respond with good morning, professor or doctor or whatever you are. That's a bad class. And I'm like, why is that a bad class? He said, if it's a good class, you'll have stunned silence and they'll write it down. They'll write it down. Why do I say you're in the patrimony of Nietzsche based on this example? Well, as I have taught now for 27 years, I think, here at the Harvard of the Hills, the Princeton of the Plains, the Berkeley of the Blackjack, the Oxford of the Oaks, the Stanford of the Sticks, the Yale of the Yahoos, otherwise known as the University of Central Oklahoma. And over the course of that time of my professorship, I have noticed a phenomenon, which is when I first started teaching, those many years ago, the vast majority of students came in and they had a notebook and they took notes and they wrote down what I said, and they didn't come to my office, although students don't come to my office anymore. They send me emails saying, I don't understand why I got a bad grade in the essay. And I'm like, well, I just went through this whole thing, and you can go back and you look at the video and it's like, you used what is not a valid ethical theory. And so you just can't pass the essay. That's the way the rubric works. You can't pass the essay portion of the exam. Now, because there's an objective portion of the exam, you can get enough points that you'll pass the exam, but you can't pass the essay. And I also told you that if you wanted to pass the essay, here's an example of what a passing essay, you wrote 1 paragraph. That's not an essay. 1 paragraph is a short answer. What you need to be doing on these essays is at a minimum, a C-level response is you get the right answer, which is that you use one of the valid ethics. I don't care which one you use. I don't care which way you argue, but there is a right or wrong answer. If you use psychological egoism, if you use subjectivism, if you use cultural relativism, you have failed, because I have said this over and over and over and over and over again in this class, that you have to use a valid theory. I don't care which one you use. And then students say, well, that's just your opinion. Well, that's postmodern. That's completely postmodern. I had a student tell me after I had this discussion through email, well, you may be an asshole. Well, okay. I can tell you that as an undergraduate, I never would have said that to a professor. But that's postmodern. This absolute questioning of authority, that's what these wheels of doubt start. And once you start them, it's hard to turn off. And you all are in the patrimony. I was in the patrimony of not postmodern when I went to college. I would never have said that to a professor. Never. And I've had it said more than once. And it may be true. I've had it written in my student evaluations. And I'm like, Again, going back to, like, tell me something I don't know. If you're going to quote me correctly, and tell me something I don't know. That I wasn't told that I was, an ass. I was told that I was a pompous ass in my student evaluation. Well, that's true. You can't go to law school and then become the associate general counsel of the third largest institution in the state, and then go on and become an executive vice president at a publicly traded company, and then decide to go get a PhD and not have, yeah, that's probably true. People who do that have some, how did I get the PhD? It's not about brains, it's about confidence. I can do this, right? So tell me something I don't know. And if you come up with something novel, I'll share it with my classes next semester in the student evaluations, right? But that's completely postmodern. Somebody posted on my Facebook page, thank God we didn't have the internet and Facebook when they were trying to cure polio. Because don't get a vaccine. That's completely postmodern. Now, what does postmodern lead to? It leads to these challenges to these systems of philosophy that, as flawed as they are, have these three things. Virtue ethics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle have these three things. Utilitarianism has these three things. Rational absolutism has these three things. Postmodernity, beginning with Kant, the wheels of doubt start turning, and we get challenges to these ideas, but they're not based on these three things. So what's the first of these? Well, the first of these challenges that we get is something called subjectivism. By the way, Karen Armstrong is perhaps the most well-read and recognized philosophical theologian today, talks about this. She talks about in the history of God, she talks about there were times when people, they said these other people were atheists, and what they meant is they didn't believe in the God that we believe in. And that was atheistic. But nobody, if you go back to the beginning of history, people could not have a true atheism. That it was not possible. It was not philosophically possible. They didn't have the ability to have this severe doubt that we have. We know this from the anthropological record, that there is a time at which there are breaks in history that man becomes different. For example, prehistory, man did not view himself in historical terms. He viewed himself in cyclical terms. Historic man insists that he's only associated with an epoch. That this idea of birth, middle age, and death is not just, it's a linear process. That is historical. Before that, man saw this as there was not a distinction between him and the cosmos. And a true atheism that we get with Kant was not always possible. So this idea, going back in history, of this completely subjective notion was almost impossible to have. This idea that you all have, that everything is up for question. Subjectivism says, look, because ethics is not like this rectilinear triangle, and it's not something that you can know a priori, because a lot of people would say that are subjectivists, they would say, look, what you're talking about when you say things like, this is knowable a priori, and when you say things like you can know what Kant comes up with, those are just, they may be logically consistent, but they are disconnected from reality. And you can't really know anything other than what it is to be yourself. And so the self is all one can know. This is what we call in philosophy solipsism. The self is all one can know. And if the self is all one can know, then ethics is whatever I believe it is for me. This is the subjectivist. And it takes on a very frightening form in something called psychological egoism. And this, again, is one of the theories that students always use and then wonder why they didn't pass the exam or the essay on the first exam. They'll say, I believe in psychological egoism. This is an attractive idea. Psychological egoism is an attractive idea. Why are these wheels of doubt so attractive? Well, because if I ask you really tough questions like, should we have abortion? Should we market abortion drugs? Right? We're going to get a lot of different answers about that. Hobby Lobby, which started in the state of Oklahoma, didn't even want to provide, they went to court because under the Affordable Care Act and President Obama, they had to provide birth control. Birth control, historic birth control, and there are types of birth control that like there's better forms of it, but historically the way birth control worked was it didn't stop the fertilization of the ovum. It prevented implantation on the uterine wall. It caused spontaneous abortion. It caused the uterine wall to shed. So they don't want to provide that. Hobby Lobby did, and under the affordable, and they got a religious exception from the courts for this. Psychological egoism says, look, either through nature or nurture or a combination of both, we react in ways that we cannot help. And students always use this because it does seem to be true. The psychological egoist seems to be true. How is it that we always behave? Well, according to the psychological egoist, we behave in very predictable ways. And a guy named Martin Lindstrom, who's a marketer, writes a book called Biology. I think I've mentioned this before. It's B-Y-O-L-O-G-Y, not bi, not B-I-O-L-O-G-Y. And what Lindstrom does is in this book, as a marketer, he looks at things. So for a long period of time in marketing, we relied on surveys to get people to tell us what they like. And it turns out what they told us in surveys is different than what they really feel. And I think I mentioned this before, like the thing about smoking, right? Turns out people actually, like, they see these ads and they're jonesing for a cigarette, right? Did I talk about psychological egoism before? Yes. Right? You can't help but like what you like. I didn't talk about subjectivism though before, did I? Yeah, okay. All right. So psychological egoism says we just can't help ourselves. You can't will yourself to not want something. And that does seem to be true. Can you will yourself to not want something? Well, for a psychological egoist, I have students every semester that say, yeah, I can will myself to not want something. And it turns out that that's really hard because you're not really willing yourself to not want something. You're willing yourself to want something more, maybe. I can deny myself the shoes. Did we talk about this example? I like shoes. These are Allen Edmonds shoes. I love Allen Edmonds shoes. And I can maybe not buy the Allen Edmonds shoes, but it's not because I really willed myself to not want them. It's because I wanted something more. Going back to the fair, what is it? I want more than the stuff that they're selling at the fair. I want my money. And I'm fascinated by what people would rather have than their own money. Right? So I have something like 12 pair of Allen Edmonds shoes, but I don't have as many as I'd like because I'd rather have my own money. That's a good place to stop, and we will talk about. Did we talk about cultural relativism in here? Have I talked about that before? No, not cultural relativism. Okay. We'll pick up with that, and then we'll finish this next time. If you want, you can delay taking the chapter 2 quiz until after we finish this. If you think you have enough knowledge to answer it, that's fine, but I will extend that and I'll send an email out on that. All right? Have a good morning. So where we were. So I remember.
Thank you.